Welcome to the Software People Stories. I'm Shiv.
I'm Chitra.
And I'm Gayatri.
We bring you interesting, untold stories of people
Associated with the creation
Or consumption of software-based solutions.
You'll hear stories of what worked,
and sometimes what didn't,
you will also hear very personal experiences.
and insights that would trigger your thoughts.
And inspire you to do even greater things.
Before we jump into today's conversation, a special thanks to PM Power Consulting for encouraging and supporting this show right from the start. With over 1,000 person-years of collective experience, PM Power has helped many organizations, teams, and individuals chart out their own journeys of excellence and make progress. Thank you, PM Power. Now, let's move to today's episode. In this episode, I'm in conversation with Greg Foster, co-founder and CTO of graphite.dev. This is the first part. In this episode, Greg talks about his journey into software from the early days and what he did during his college and early career that led to founding of graphite.dev. With a passion for developer experience, how he's been able to build tools that improve software development workflows. He shares a lot of his experiences about being on call in companies like Airbnb and building a startup and Graphite's mission. Listen on. Hi, Greg. Welcome to the Software People Stories.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me, Shiv.
Yeah, I'm quite curious about all that you've done. But then before I get ahead of myself, we'll start with your career trajectory, how you got into IT, what are the things that you've been doing, and then we'll take it from there.
Of course. Yeah. Happy to talk about my story a little bit, interject if you have questions at any point. But I've been writing software and coding for, I think, maybe close to 15 years now. I started when I was in high school. I grew up in Reno, Nevada, which is quite a random place, kind of in the middle of nowhere. Beautiful weather though. I really enjoyed it. And when I turned 15, my parents were like, "Hey, you got to get a job. You know, you're old enough to start working. You got to get a job." And I took my little high school resume, where it just has a couple of classes on it, and I went to all the local Starbuckses and the local restaurants. I was like, "Hey, can you hire me?" And they all said no. I think this was not long after like the financial crisis and stuff, and they were not giving jobs to high schoolers. And so I was having trouble getting a job, but I said, okay, what if I start coding and making iPhone apps? I knew one other person in high school who wrote code, and I thought it was kind of a cool idea. So I started looking up tutorials online about how this is iOS 4 level days. I know we're like there's many operating systems since, but it was early days of iOS. People were selling like apps for $1 on the App Store. There wasn't subscriptions, and I took the family computer. It was a Windows computer, but I think I pirated VMware and then like a Mac OS image onto it. From there, I didn't have an iPhone, but I could run a simulator of an iPhone. And I started coding iPhone apps, really basic utilities, and selling them for like $1. And that was my first foray into creating software. I think my very first app, it was like a pros and cons list, and it did pretty well in the App Store. It was one of the only pros and cons list apps at the time. I remember it had a memory leak, so you couldn't even run it for more than 30 minutes without it crashing. But luckily, not many people ran it for more than 30 minutes without it crashing. But yeah, and I just found this deep love of engineering, coding, and I've continued pulling on that thread and created a whole career out of it.
Yeah, wonderful. But what got you interested in software?
You know, so I always loved computers. I loved playing video games. My parents would always push me to sports, and I would do them, but I would like run home to like go play a video game.
Yeah.
And initially, I was okay at graphic design, and I would make just as like an artistic expression. I would go on Photoshop and I'd make like images and do photography, and then I would use my like computer, my phone. I'd use all the software. And it's like, well, I can make the pictures and I use the software, like what's the gap to actually making the software? Like I really want to close that loop. And it felt like I knew both ends of the spectrum. And so that curiosity kind of drove me again, then some Googling, some I think like Coding for Dummies kind of early books. And I just kind of taught myself.
Wonderful. Now, technology keeps changing. And I see that you've also been in some of the large infrastructure organizations and so on. So from being, let's say, an individual developer who's probably writing apps to sell, how was the transition both in terms of the workplace when you had to work with large teams and in terms of even thinking of huge problems to solve?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was a great transition. Like for me, coding started as this independent hobby and this independent job in high school. And then I go to college and I studied CS as my major. And I was thrilled because in high school, I was running home from my classes as early as possible and trying to skip my homework so I had time to write more code. And I'd wake up at like 5 a.m. because I was like trying to finish coding before I had to go to school. And so it was really exciting in college. I'm like, okay, great. I can take classes. I don't have to like fudge around this. But then I started getting internships and then eventually a full-time job as a software engineer. And that was even better because I was like, great, not only can I do this work, but unlike in school where you do a coding homework, and then they throw it away, and then you do another one, and then you throw it away. This is actually real stuff that's part of a living system that I'm getting paid for. I'm part of a bigger team. It's serving real users. These aren't just like exercises and thought experiments. This is like real deal stuff. So it felt less like a meaningful transition and more just like an exciting, okay, now this is real. For a while, this is intellectually interesting, this is fun, but now I'm actually contributing to these living, breathing systems. And I remember there was a big moment when I started working at Airbnb, initially as an intern and then later full-time. And I knew iOS development from high school. I didn't know infrastructure development. I was hired as an iOS engineer, but immediately due to staffing mismatches, they're like, whatever, you're going to go on the infrastructure team. You're going to manage Airbnb's notification systems, online job queues, emails, SMSs, really big, heavy duty stuff. And I knew nothing. I was way out of my league. But I did feel this wonderful sense of what I remember. I felt like for the first time ever, I was taking care of a living system. Whereas when you make iPhone apps or some of these other things, it's as though you're writing an article, writing a book. You create something really special and you ship it and it's out there, it's gone. These days it's a little different. Now I think people more continuously update their apps. But for me, back in the day in high school, I would create it, I'd ship it, and I would be kind of done with it. And it felt so different to be on call, working on a real-time server, a system. It can run out of memory in the middle of the night. It can page you, it can have errors. I felt like I was like a farmer taking care of these animals in a field. I'm like, wow, these things are really alive and breathing. And that felt like a big transition moment too. But actually something I love, despite how much it woke me up in the middle of the night, something I also really loved.
Okay, two questions triggered by this. One is how was it getting all these calls and then from probably users who are a little upset or waiting and anxious on one side? And then how do you go about isolating the problem or trying to find out what the fix is and then do that?
Yeah. I actually really loved doing on-call work with Airbnb, and it was a little sadistic because I would always volunteer to be on call. I would be on call for both the systems I was actually running, and then there was a volunteer rotation for the entire company. So if there were systems that went down in the middle of the night that you weren't responsible for, you could volunteer and be on call for those. And I think when I left I was there for about 3 years, and I remember I looked at pager duty, and I'd been paged about 2,500 times in my like 3 years there. Many are in the middle of the night. But I really enjoyed it because what I found was when you get paged, there's an exhilaration, there's an excitement to it. It's much lower stakes than being a doctor, of course. No one's dying. But at Airbnb, it meant, you're right, like there's real users. There's someone who's locked out of a home, who can't either on vacation, they're scared, they're a little bit concerned. There's real problems happening when things go down. And it was exciting. And so what I would do, Airbnb was arranged as a microservice architecture, so tons of different little services, each with different teams managing it. And we were heavy users of Datadog for observability. So I got really good at going to Datadog, looking at the logs, looking at the metrics, identifying what the issue was. And I got very good at actually deployment management because, and this is maybe the answer to your question, most frequently, the best way to resolve an incident was to figure out what changed and then roll it back. And usually what changed was a code deployment. It could be worse. It could be an infrastructure change without a code deployment. It could be a database schema migration. But I would say, at least in my experience, 7 out of 10, 8 out of 10 times, it was a bad code deployment. We had to just identify it, execute a rollback, and notify that person.
So how is it about handling users? Did you have to interact with them? It's only as the backend.
Not too much. Airbnb was large enough, and this is interesting. I think when you're in smaller companies, I'm at a small startup now. When something goes wrong, you have to do double duty. You have to both fix the problem and manage the user's expectations. Right. Immediately go into a shared Slack channel and start saying like, "Hey, I'm sorry, we're down. Just want to let you know. Here's what's up." At Airbnb, it was large enough where I was not on the front lines of the customer service. However, people would still get to me. Because I would be running again. I shouldn't have been. I was too young. I was a new grad, but because people like quit and got shuffled around, I eventually found myself where I was like semi-independently managing like all the email, SMS, and notification systems. And I remember like sometimes there'd be users who would fall through the cracks because email and SMS, right? These are so fiddly of systems to debug and make sure they're getting right. And sometimes like, it'd be a user in a different country and it's not actually Airbnb's fault. It's like their telco provider is like dropping the SMS or something. But God, and also the users of Airbnb, sometimes it'd be like a 70-year-old, Italian grandpa who's like renting out his like home and stuff. And I would get letters written to me. It was crazy. Once in a while, people would handwrite me letters and being like, "Hi, like I love being an Airbnb host, but I haven't gotten an email in like a year. I think something's broken." And I would get this letter, my heart would break. I'm like, "Oh my God, it's actually my fault. Like I'm the reason you're like having trouble earning an income and doing your hosting because my email system is broken for you." One time, this is really interesting. One time there was a British taxi cab driver who started tweeting really angrily. And he was tweeting, he was using obscenities, and he was like, "I'm so pissed at Airbnb. They're sending me thousands and tens of thousands of SMS text messages, and it's destroying my phone. I can't even use my phone because I'm just getting all these text messages." And we're like, "Okay, gosh, like this guy's making a public scene. We got to debug this and everything." So I go in and I investigate, and I'm looking at our logs, and I'm like, "I don't think we're sending this from everything I can tell, we're not actually sending this person like hundreds of thusans of text messages. That sounds horrible." But he's sharing screenshots, and he's definitely getting them. And what had happened was Airbnb, we used like Twilio, so there was you could respond to an automated text from Airbnb, and Airbnb would then we would set it up where Twilio would say, "Hey, you actually can't text this number." It would be like an automated reply back. And this user had set on his phone provider kind of an out of office message. He sent a message saying like, "Hey, I'm going to be offline for a couple of weeks," and suddenly him and Airbnb's automated systems just start ping-ponging back and forth at the speed of light, and he's getting racked 100,000. We hard disconnect him and hard block him on Twilio, and yet it took a week of him just continually receiving like this trailing end of messages. I felt so bad. But so we ran into lots of like interesting, silly issues. And of course, it's both funny and it affects real people's lives. So I don't want to make fun of it too much, but that's the nature when you're working with like a million people. There's always people at the edges who run into weird edge cases.
I can totally relate to that. The very first program that I wrote got into an infinite loop and started spewing out paper. I just something and then everybody panicked. Something to break it.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Right. So that was about the user side. Now, also mentioned that once something like this happens, you also inform the dev.
Yeah.
How was that relationship? You call that? Okay. Usually, we always consider that as a strained relationship.
Yeah. So I spent most of my, and to this day, spent my career working on developer tools. So whether I was building notification systems for product teams to build on top of, if I was on call, I'm helping other teams keep their systems online. Now I work at Graphite, where we build like code review systems, but the same thing, all of my users are just other engineers, other developers. And it goes back and forth. So I think on a fundamental level, I love it. I really like where my work and my main users are not actually end customers. That in a sense, they're not the average consumer. They're like really smart engineers, and they're people who think like me and who have similar biases and similar excitements, and also are very nitpicky and are really harsh critics as well. I really like it. I think there's something very fulfilling. Most of my best friends in life are other software engineers at many different companies, and nothing makes me happier than the fact that the stuff I build gets to be used by my friends and the people I really respect and look up to. Now, to your point, it also can be a little bit strained. I think when you do on-call work for too long, it can definitely create a jaded sense of the world. I used to volunteer and help manage Airbnb's deployment trains. And a lot of bigger companies will have this. They'll have someone who's helping usher out the code changes and the deployments because people are merging at a high enough volume where you actually need a little human coordination. And when you do jobs like this, that or on call long enough, you do become a little bit cynical, a little bit jaded, because you're just watching, you're watching silly mistake after silly mistake over and over again, and you're witnessing someone being a little bit irresponsible affect and block hundreds or thousands of other engineers. And so often someone would merge in a bad code change, and then they would just drive home, close their laptop, and you're like, hey man, come on, be a little bit better, be a little bit more aware of like how you're affecting the people around you. So sometimes I think every team who does on-call or deployment management long enough eventually starts wondering, should I build a karma system? And should there be a way of programmatically, penalizing people for breaking deployments too frequently? But it never gets done. And I think that, that again, that comes from a jaded place. Nowadays, I do less on-call work and more just building tools for other engineers. And in general, I wouldn't trade it. It's very fulfilling. It's so great. So many users, they're not only are they like, hey, I have this bug, please fix it for me. They're like, I have this bug. I looked into my console logs. I found that it was a 500 error. I actually think I know what's going wrong. I sketched out on a notepad. Here's a photo. I'm like, wow, you guys are great. These are the users I want. You're really working together on this.
Yeah. So before we get into Graphite and the kind of work that you do, what was the bug that bit you to start up?
What was the bug that bit me to do a startup? I was really happy working at Airbnb, and I would have been very happy going to other really cool companies like, I don't know, Stripe, or there's so many interesting companies with great cultures. I just want two things in my career. I wanted two things. I still want two things in my career. I want to build really interesting, cool systems, and I want to do it with my friends. I want to do it with people I really love. And I created a startup, Graphite, out in New York because it was the intersection of those two things. There's a lot of places I can build cool stuff. That's important. But I had two best friends from college who were living out in New York. I was in San Francisco at the time. And there was a rare moment in all of our careers where we were open and ready to leave and try something new. I was like, oh, wow, that doesn't, with three people, that doesn't come around too frequently, where everyone's in that moment in their careers, they're open to taking a risk. And when we first set off, it was, okay, let's move out to New York. We know we love dev tools. We know we love, software quality. Let's build in this space. We don't know exactly what the perfect idea is going to be, but let's work together. Let's build something special here. And for me, it wasn't about creating a incredible, high-flying startup. It was about working on some fun interventions with my best friends. And if I could do that for a few years and we could pull on that thread, I was like, whether it's successful or not, I'm never going to regret this because I get to do what I love. I think there was one thing I lamented a little bit at Airbnb. I really liked my teammates. I had a really nice time, but these weren't my best friends in my life. My best friends were from outside of work. They're from college and stuff. And so I was really excited and drawn to this idea of like, what would it be like to to take the people you're closest to and actually just try to do your life's best work. And so that's what drew me out.
But when you are running a company, it's more than just the code. All the other infrastructure that you need, the HR systems or the legal and other angles that are there. And of course, making sure that the paychecks are all processed in time, etc. So how did that How did you take those things?
Yeah, you're right. You have to wear a lot of hats. You have to do everything.
Mhm.
In fact, I think in the early stages of the startup, it's too easy to spend too much time writing code
Mhm.
and not talking to users, validating ideas, doing like actual business operations, hiring. There's so much work that feels foreign and grinding and difficult that the
Mhm.
easiest thing is just sit around and code. And it's often, I think, in the early stage of startup, is often actually not the best use of your time.
Mhm.
Um, I don't think I did this perfectly. I think I actually coded too much and I didn't do enough of the business operations side. Luckily, I have, like I mentioned, I have two amazing co-founders, one of which, Merrill, works as the CEO, and he was formerly a PM, and he has been an absolute saint, and he's been incredible at, from day one, getting really involved in handling so many of the business operations,
Mhm.
affording me time to code, even though I should probably still be talking to users and coding a little bit less. Um, so, but one thing I had to get really good at was hiring, and spending a lot of time, like you say, working with people, hiring, going, outreaching to thousands of people, going on hundreds of coffee chats, then running interviews, then figuring out how do you actually present an offer in a compelling manner, then how do you onboard that person to the team? How do you make sure that they're successful? That whole thing was all a different skill set, all very, very foreign to me. All I knew was how to write code pretty well.
Mhm.
And so, but you gotta learn. And then, what's the nice thing about doing a startup is it's do or die. You're in a situation where no one's going to do it for you, and if you don't do it, it's not going to happen. So it's a great forcing function to just jump off into the deep end and start figuring it out. And you come up with all these questions, but it's great to have questions because now you can actually ask your mentors
Mhm.
something important. So,
Yeah. So as you build this team,
mhm.
how do you ensure that the same intensity of or the passion for writing code, writing good code, uh,
Yeah, yeah,
is imbibed in everybody in the team?
that's a good question. This is tricky. I mean, we can't ensure things to a perfect degree. The best we can do is try to hire people with wonderful values and with a deep passion and a track record of a passion of working on these kinds of topics. And then once they're in the room, hopefully that remains true. Hopefully we got it right in the hiring process, and hopefully we're driving a really positive culture that keeps lighting a fire for that passion. Luckily, because we work on dev tools, hiring engineers who are really excited to also work on engineering systems
Mhm.
is actually not the hardest thing we do. Um, I actually think we have a harder time hiring designers and other roles. But because our user base is already engineers and they're already a little bit familiar with what we build, maybe they're already users of what we build, there's actually already a default set of passionate people who are really excited about this space. So we have a little bit of an easier time. And then the other thing we do is somewhat alternatively, ironically, but we are a full in-person team. In fact, behind you on this camera, this is our office. We're about 25, going on 30 people, and from day one, 2020, we've chosen to be a full in-person company, um, partly because we think it's going to lead to faster communication, more excitement, more passion in the room. I worked with my co-founders because I wanted to build cool stuff with people I really cared about, and I want that to be something that happens for all the employees across the team. And I think that if they're in person, they're going to have better relationships. They're going to be more passionate about what we're creating. There's a sense of physicality to everything that we're building. It's both the product, but also the company itself and the space. And if you can be in that space, living and breathing it, I think it helps keep the energy going more too.
Now, a little bit about what problem does graphite solve?
Sure, yeah. So Graphite, for context, we're a modern developer productivity platform. Think about tools like GitHub, very popular, but also lesser known tools that have spun out of Facebook or Google. You have Fabricator, you have Critique, then you also have things like GitLab, you have Bitbucket. You have a sequence of tools throughout history around software collaboration. How do you create the code changes, get them reviewed, merge them in, test them? How do you go through the whole outer loop of development? Uh, it's a really interesting space to us. We think that it's been a little bit under innovated. GitHub around 2010, a little bit before 2010, got very popular and then very quickly became somewhat of a dominant just option in the entire industry. There's a couple other people, but it's mostly just GitHub. And they brought a really straightforward innovation, which was to say, let's put Git in the cloud. Before that, Git was pretty popular. It was gaining popularity, but you couldn't do it in the cloud. And so GitHub was like, great, Git in the cloud, awesome. Later, through competitive pressures from GitLab and an acquisition from Microsoft, they layered in some CI-based tooling of GitHub Actions. And then now they're investing very heavily in AI. So they're doing like Copilot and so on. But I think that there's been a dearth of investment back in the original collaboration space. How do a couple people on a team, on a high-performance team, work together and create wonderful code changes that are small, that are fast, that are shipping out? And what we've seen is that large private companies, Google, Facebook, so on, have actually built better tooling. They've kept innovating. They've found faster, more efficient ways to ship code that haven't actually trickled out to the main tooling that everyone uses, like GitHub or GitLab. So one example of this is stacked code changes, which is simply saying, rather than each pull request being small and independent, what if you or large and independent, what if you made them all really small and you stack them on top of each other? You create chains of code changes, faster review, parallel the testing of them, merge them in however you want. So what we've done with Graphite is we've built this platform to layer on top of GitHub. Anyone can adopt it, bottoms-up adoption, but we're providing a suite of more efficient and faster tools and ideas inspired by what the bigger companies are already doing. But in this case, you don't have to work at Google or Facebook to have access to the state-of-the-art, the really fast, amazing tooling. If your existing team already uses GitHub, that's fine, great. Use Graphite and you can have access to these more efficient workflows. And it's gone really well. People have seemingly really liked it. So
is that more in the static code analysis space, or do you do something beyond that?
We focus primarily on the code changes themselves. So creating the code change. So a CLI locally that helps you very effectively create stacks of small pull requests, getting those reviewed through a web UI. So an inbox that makes it really easy to find the code changes, and then a great powerful UI for reviewing them, commenting on them, and a little static analysis, such as like some AI tools to help analyze those code changes, spot common bugs. And then lastly, features around merging in those code changes. So abilities to both merge, but also merge in stacks of code changes, a merge queue to help coordinate merges across larger teams. We're trying to focus on that loop, the life cycle of a code change itself, and how can we provide you the best tooling to be fast and effective throughout this whole process. Because it's interesting, I think the average developer is spending hours a day doing this stuff. It's not just writing the code, it's going and reviewing the pull requests. It's leaving comments, it's responding to comments, it's pulling back down the changes, fixing something, pushing it back up, waiting for CI. Now you're trying to get it to merge in. This is a huge part of the day-to-day job. And if we can help make it more pleasurable, if we can speed it up, help you be more productive in it, I think it's an incredible point of leverage that we can bring to all software engineers.
Yeah. I'm curious about the AI part that you mentioned in the reviews.
Sure.
Is that your own knowledge base that you've built? As we were getting towards the topic of AI, I asked him whether they've been able to build a knowledge base that can train their AI for reviews. The answer to that and more in the next episode. Don't miss it.
We thank Siddharth for the music and Anita for promoting the Software People stories.
If you like this episode,
Please subscribe on your favorite podcast client.
And spread the word in your network.
if you'd like to share your story,
Contact us at podcasts@pm-powerconsulting.com.